right, we're going to start out tonight by taking a look at these two questions right here together. And the reason why I'm going to say right here together is because I'm going to use this as a shameless plug for the next Bible study that we're going to be doing. And so I'm not going to really cover these like in a whole lot of depth, because our next Bible study that we're going to do after we finish up here is we're going to be taking a look at how we got our Bibles. And we're going to be looking at topics like revelation and inspiration. And in doing such, I hope that we come away with it with, number one, a better understanding of how we got our Bibles, but number two, to better appreciate what God has done to give us His Word, and to have a better, a fuller faith in the Word of God, in what to, what we can, how it can support us. Okay. All right. So as far as the first question number 21, it says, how were the books of the Bible selected to be part of the Bible? And all of that has to do with an answer called canonization. That is a topic that we're going to cover here in a couple of weeks, and so I'm not going to go into in depth with it, other than to say that canonization was a process in which both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jews and Christians kind of went through a process of determining what was inspired, and then cataloging and putting all those things together. One thing that we don't need to understand about canonization is some people will say, well, canonization, that is where people decided what was going to be in the Bible and decided what was inspired. And that really was not the approach of it. What the approach of it is that people had already accepted writings as being inspired and as being the Word of God. And so what they did was they, kind of went through and said, okay, is this valid, number one? And number two, are there other things, are there other scrolls out there, letters out there that should be in this? And number three, it was just kind of a cataloging and saying, okay, this is what we've got. And it really was a process in which both the Old Testament and then later on the New Testament to say, this is all we've got. This is what we have, and this is going to be our rule. This is going to be our measure. That's what the word canon means. It's our rule of faith and practice for both the Old Testament and then later on for the New Testament, okay? And so there's a whole lot more about that, but we'll just kind of leave it right there for now, and then we're going to talk about it more later on. Okay? All right, so moving on to this next question. What are the differences between the KJV and NIV, and is there any value to studying both? I'm going to go over this, and after we have the lessons, it's going to make more sense, okay? But I hope I'm not going to, first of all, eat up too much time, and secondly, I'm going to cover it. But as far as main differences between the NIV and the KJV, first of all, we've got a method of translation. Secondly, we have got the Greek text. And then third that we've got is bias. This, when I was looking at it, I was thinking, okay, what are the differences between the King James and the NIV? And I think that this pretty much is the major things. I mean, there's the obvious things, and that is, the King James has, older English language. The these and the thous, the NIV, has updated modern language. And so, I mean, that's the obvious thing. But, kind of the underneath the hood type thing, I think that this is what we've got here. Now, as far as a method of translation goes, the NIV utilized what's called dynamic equivalent. And some people will misunderstand dynamic equivalent and say that's a paraphrase. And that's actually not a paraphrase. A paraphrase is something entirely different. But a dynamic equivalent is going to be looking at something grammatically, and then instead of trying to translate words and phrases, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be looking and saying, okay, how was this word, or how is this phrase in the original language, and what would best express it in the in modern English. I think that many times what we do is when we look at translation, we're only focused on one aspect of it, and that's lexicography. Okay, we oftentimes think, oh, well, you've got these meanings here in Greek, and you've got meanings here in English, and all you do is you just take the meaning of this word and the meaning of that word and the meaning of that word. And if you were to do that, and you were to come up with a word-for-word literal translation of the New Testament, you really wouldn't be able to understand it. And the reason for it is because word definition is only part of it. When you're translating, you've also got to take syntax into consideration. And syntax is how the sentence is going to function, and how you've got participles, and you've got infinitive clauses, and you've got all kinds of different things, and how they're individually going together. And I oftentimes think that a language, our language that we speak, is a lot of times kind of like a computer code, a computer language, because there's sometimes that the one language does not translate into another language. And you've heard people say it's lost in translation, and that really is a real thing. And the reason for it is because there are different syntaxes that are involved. Word definition is really just a small part of translation. And so then the third part of it is you've got idiomatic expressions too, okay? And so dynamic equivalent is a method that kind of takes those things more into consideration. By the way, the King James and every other translation that's out there also uses some form of this. It's not a direct word-for-word translation. There are some times that you're looking at something in Greek, or you're looking at something in English, and you can't just take the word-for-word translation of it. You have to go and you have to say, okay, how is this functioning? And then from that function, how does that translate into English, okay? And so, the NIV, it really utilizes that. The King James doesn't utilize it at all. And I remember way back when I was in Greek in seminary, and I was translating James, and I remember being on, a high horse senior rant with some of my roommates one time saying, can you believe the NIV translated that participle as a conjunction, as because? Why did they do something like that? Why couldn't they just keep it as a participle? And then I was working on that because I was going to preach from James, and in the pulpit, I said, now why is this? It's because, and I went, oh, that's why they did it. So, okay, so that's one big difference, all right? Another difference has to do with the Greek texts that are used, okay? Now, here's another misconceived idea. Misconceived idea is that, the New Testament was originally written, inspired in Greek, and that those scrolls are in a museum somewhere, all preserved, and we've got it right there to compare to, and it really is not the case. Instead, we've got copy after copy after copy after copy. What happened was that in the western side of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church started to use Latin. The eastern side, the Eastern Orthodox, they continued to use Greek. Now, when you're talking about using scrolls, and by the way, this was not just simply, oh, here, have a scroll, have a free scroll, we're passing out. No, they didn't do that. These were kept in monasteries, and these were just simply used by the priest for different things. And so for the Roman Catholic Church, they used Latin. For the Eastern Orthodox Church, they used Greek, the Greek text. And so as these things would have started to degrade over time, they would replace them and replenish them and so on and so forth. Now, along about the time of the Protestant Reformation and the printing press, both of these two things coincide together in history. There's a man named Decidius Erasmus. He was a Catholic scholar, and he was a Catholic, Catholic scholar, Catholic priest, And he went and got together, he decided, I'm going to put together a Greek New Testament. Okay? They didn't have those before. You just simply had these scrolls. Now, he was Roman Catholic, and so there really weren't any Greek scrolls where he was at. And so what did he do? He went over to the east, to the Eastern Orthodox, and to those countries, and he started to get scrolls. He got about 8 copies of Greek, the Greek New Testament, and he combined them all together, and he made the Greek, his Greek New Testament. That is what the King James, of course, that was revised and revised and revised and revised, because this was in about 1500. King James was translated in 1611, and so there was many different revisions of that until the King James came along. But they were all based on those Eastern scrolls. Now, as the century started to move forward and people started to get into archaeology, then all of a sudden they started to discover more scrolls, and they started to discover scrolls that were found in the western side, not the eastern side. Western side, these are going to be older because these were going to be tucked away in basements and in corners and so on and so forth. And as they started to do that, they started to notice differences. Okay? Now, once we start to get into this, we'll talk about the differences. The differences are not differences as far as differences in doctrine. They're not differences that are there that should make us throw up our hands. Most of the differences have to do with differences in spelling, because spelling was not standardized at the time. But there are differences between all the Greek texts. And we shouldn't be alarmed, because people were copying these things down by hand, okay? And so the NIV is going to be using UBS, United Bible Society's Greek text. I forgot what version it is, but it's going to be a modern Greek text that's going to take into consideration more of these different scrolls, okay? Now, some people will say, no, we need these over here because they're more faithful. Other people are saying, no, we need all of these over here because they're going to be more accurate, okay? And that's a debate that we're going to have later. Just simply know that right now, that's another one of the key differences between the King James, and not just simply the King James in NIV, but King James in other modern translations. There are some modern translations that stick back to the other text. Third thing is bias, okay? Bias is something, and I'm not even, trying to talk down about this, because bias is there in every single translation. There are times when somebody's translating, it can be either this way or that way. And the translator has to choose, is it translated this way or is it translated that way? Is this verb translated as a present indicative active, or is this translated as a command? Okay? And so they say, okay, well, context says. Well, when you are looking at context, oftentimes what you're going to do is you're going to fall back on a bias. Okay? And again, I'm not trying to say that in and of itself is bad, because sometimes, if your bias is right, your bias is right. And sometimes bias kind of helps you stay in a lane, so to speak. But there is a certain amount of bias that is baked into all the texts or all the translations. Now, as far as the King James goes, the bias isn't just simply the bias with the translators. The bias is with a denomination, because the King James was commissioned by King James. And King James was an Anglican. He was from the Church of England. All of the translators of the King James were from the Church of England. As a matter of fact, none of them were even Puritans. And forget about, Baptists and Presbyterians and all the others that were very much not invited to the party. But some of the things that King James laid down when he commissioned the translators to translate the King James Bible was that they could not go against the Church of England, obviously, and secondly, they had to use the old ecclesiastical words. You say, what are old ecclesiastical words? Ecclesiastical words were words that were church words that were in common use of the day, that some of the other translations of the day were not translating. For example, the word church is an ecclesiastical word that they were supposed to use, okay? Other translations of the day, a little bit before this, were translating this word, church, or at least the Greek part of this word, as what it was defined as, which is congregation, okay? And so in some of those instances, that would have kind of gone against some of the theological biases of the translators and of the Church of England at the time. And so therefore, you have to translate it as church. And so when you take a look at Acts chapter 7, and I think it's even verse 37 or 39, in the King James, it talks about the church in the wilderness, talking about the Israelites leaving Exodus. And you're like, you know, if you think about it, it's like, why did they use the word church? Well, they use the word church because it's like, okay, well, you know, this has spiritual connotations to it, and we can't really go against the dictates, so we're going to translate it as church when, you know, it really should be the congregation because it was the assembly that was coming out of Exodus, okay? And so you've got that bias with the King James. Now, the NIV, on the other hand, what they did was they took, and I forgot you know, you can take a look at the footnotes of it, but I think they said like, you know, 30 different scholars, 70 different scholars to translate or have boards to revise it. But they went and they tried to get all kinds of people from all kinds of denomination. And so you don't have those denomination biases that are baked into the translation, but at the same time, you still have bias. And one of the biases that's there in the NIV is the same biases that's in the King James, and that is the ecclesiastical words are still in place. They don't translate them, they transliterate them, or excuse me, not, in one case, baptize, transliterate. In this case, they just have this other definition to it, to where by using it, people are coming up with theological definitions instead of actual word definitions. Okay? All right. Okay. Questions and comments about that one?
So is church and congregation interchangeable then?
Congregation is actually a definition for church. The Greek word that is used, I won't spell it out in Greek, but it is, well, I probably will spell it out in Greek because ecclesia, okay? And the way that ecclesia, when the Bible was written, was talking about a congregation. It was talking about assembly. Okay, that's the definition of it. The word church actually has its derivation from another Greek word called kyriakon. Somehow, the idea, the concept of ecclesia got over to this idea about the Lord's belonging, what belongs to a Lord. And it probably more had to do with a building than it did with the people. But our word ecclesiastical actually comes from ecclesia. And it has now more to do with religion than it does actually what it was. But anyway, that's the short answer for church and how we got it. And to define it, it's really got to be defined as congregation. Man, that's another question altogether. Most important thing to the question of back here of number, what is it, 22. The most important thing to this is there's value to studying both. That was the most important thing. I can't believe I forgot it. Yes, there is value to studying both. Okay, because number one, you're studying the Bible, right? And it doesn't matter. I mean, if it is a translation, it doesn't matter who translated it. If you're studying the Bible, you're studying the Bible. You're studying the Bible. There is value to it. There is value in studying the King James because it does make you slow down and stop and consider all the little things. at the same time, there is value to studying the NIV, because with the NIV, you can speed up and you can start to see bigger pictures about things too. But the main thing is, studying both or studying others, studying is the most important thing.